All right, let's talk about some what if scenarios in the world of college football for the 2025 season. I'm doing this series of prediction videos that I do every offseason, team by team, winner and a loser every single week, do about 40 or 50 teams. I've done about 12 so far, and we're going to get right back to those either, this afternoon or tomorrow. But like one of the reasons I haven't done these three teams, what we're going to talk about today, Georgia Tech, Florida, and Ohio State, is I still have questions about these three teams, things I'm trying to kind of figure out on my own in my head, nail down what I think's going to happen with certain games or certain situations or certain players involving these teams. And I've actually got a list here, I don't know, 10 or 15, what if scenarios. What if this happens? What would that mean, right? And we're only going to do about 3 today because I'm going to try to keep these videos between like 10 to 15 minutes long. But if you like this video and you want to see me do more kind of what if type scenario videos over the next month or whatever leading up to the start of the season, let me know. Hit the thumbs up, leave a comment and let me know. But so these scenarios that I want to talk about involving these 3 teams. Now, in my opinion, these are things that probably aren't likely to happen. In other words, if you were to put a percentage on the probability of these things happening, we'll just start with Georgia Tech beating Clemson. If you were to put a percentage on that, it's probably under 50%, right? But I don't think it's like crazy to think that Georgia Tech could beat Clemson. So I want to talk about what if Georgia Tech beats Clemson? What if DJ Lagway at Florida stays healthy all year and plays like he did all year when he was healthy last year, minus the turnovers, which you can attribute maybe to being a true freshman, right? You see that from a lot of true freshman QBs. There are, I think, legitimate concerns about his durability. He was hurt several times last year, missed some time last year, was out for the entirety of the spring with kind of an unknown arm or shoulder type issue. But what happens if he is able to stay healthy and play at a high level or even an improved level now that he's in year 2 over what we saw him do last year? What would that mean for Florida in 2025? I want to talk about that. And lastly, what if Ohio State loses to Michigan again? Now, unlike the other 2, I think there's at least a 50% chance that happens. So what's it doing on this list? Well, I want to go a step further with the Ohio State losing to Michigan what if scenario. What if Ohio State already has a couple of losses and a third loss? Michigan becomes their third loss. And they wind up missing the playoffs kind of specifically because they lose to Michigan. Now, they've lost to Michigan a lot. Was it 4 years in a row, I guess? 21, 22, 23, and 24. But in a couple of those years, they were still able to make the playoffs, right? Last year being one of those years, winning the national title. But still, the fans are a little fed up with losing to Michigan, and the national title does help to heal some of that wound. There's no doubt about it. But what if they lose again to Michigan, and it's a third loss that knocks them out of the playoffs? What would that mean? All right, let's start with the Georgia Tech and Clemson one, though. This one, to me, might be the most interesting of the ones we're going to talk about today. Here's Georgia Tech's schedule. Now, you're going to tell me Georgia Tech's not a great team, and I'll tell you I might agree with that, okay? But keep in mind, we're in a new age here of playoffs. 12 teams get in. Somebody's getting in from the ACC, guaranteed at least 1, maybe 2, right? And one of the things that we have learned over the last couple of years as these conferences have expanded, they've done away with divisions, and the playoffs have gotten bigger. Who you play in terms of how your conference schedule is extremely important. You can go to any conference you want, and you can pick out a couple of teams from the same conference, and one of those teams is going to have a lot more difficult schedule than the other. And, Wisconsin is an example in the Big Ten of a team that's got just a ridiculously hard schedule relative to some of the other teams in the Big Ten. Florida and Oklahoma in the SEC, ridiculously hard schedule compared to, say, a Missouri or a Texas, maybe, right? And the ACC is the same way. So before you just dismiss this out of hand and say, well, Clemson's better than Georgia Tech, they're going to win the game. I agree. Clemson is better than Georgia Tech, all right? But there's a reason we all sit down and watch these games on Saturday. And one of those reasons is the better team doesn't always win. And Georgia Tech, They weren't great last year, but let's not forget how they ended the regular season, right? They beat Miami, rained on that parade, nearly beat Georgia, took them to, was it 7 or 8 overtimes on the road in Athens and nearly beat them, came up short, but nearly beat them, beat Florida State. But what was the problem with Georgia Tech? Well, it was inconsistency more than anything else. I'll pull up last year's schedule real quick. So, they beat Florida State in week 0. At the time, we thought that was a great win. Turns out Florida State was terrible. So it's good that Georgia Tech won that game as opposed to losing it. But looking back on it, it wasn't that great of a win beating Florida State by 3. But then they roll over Georgia State. They lose to Syracuse. Again, at the time, looked like a bad loss. Syracuse had a first-year head coach, a bunch of new players. We didn't know anything about them. Well, at the end of the year, you look back and you say, wow, Syracuse was pretty good. They went 9-3, right? Then they beat VMI. They lose to Louisville. Again, Louisville's one of the, top 3 to 4 teams in the ACC right now. Not an excuse for losing. You got to start winning these games if you're Georgia Tech. But then they beat Duke. Duke was a good team last year. They won 8 or 9 games. They beat North Carolina. North Carolina, not good. Blown out by Notre Dame. Lost to Virginia Tech 21-6. This is the one that makes no sense. This is the game right here that Georgia Tech's got to stop losing. And that's easier said than done. Because I say this all the time in my prediction videos. No matter how good or bad a team is, they usually beat somebody you don't expect them to beat. In Georgia Tech's case, they beat Florida State. They beat Miami. No one expected that, or very few people expected that heading into the season. And every single team loses at least one game you don't expect them to lose. They shouldn't have lost this game to Virginia Tech, right? You can sort of justify the loss to Syracuse. They ended up being a good team. You can certainly justify the losses to Louisville and Notre Dame. To Virginia Tech, no. Got to stop losing that game. But then they had the bye week, and then they had the big win over Miami, which basically ruined their season. They beat NC State. It was close, but they beat them 30-29, and then the close loss to Georgia, and then the bowl game loss. And you can make of that what you will. Different people have different opinions on the bowl games and how much they mean or don't mean anymore. So inconsistent, but good enough when they play well to beat and compete with some pretty good teams, right? They beat Miami. Took Georgia to the wire, 7 or 8 overtimes. So you look at Georgia Tech this year and you say, what, they got Haynes King coming back? Should have a pretty good offense again. The coaching staff now has been there for a few years. The players should be bought in. There's a lot of sort of excitement around the Georgia Tech program, at least a level of excitement that hasn't been there in a long time. You go back to the Jeff Collins era was just a disaster. And even the end of the Paul Johnson era, the fans had sort of started to turn on him a little. So it's kind of, as far as the Georgia Tech fans go, I think they're really looking forward to this season. They have the game at Colorado. Now, I haven't done a Georgia Tech prediction video yet, but I have done a Colorado video. I think Georgia Tech wins that game at Colorado. There's too much new out there. They lost everything good they had, really. And with Travis Hunter, Shedeur Sanders, Shiloh Sanders, they're all gone. All the receivers are gone. Worst running team in the country 2 years straight. Georgia Tech should be able to control that game along the lines of scrimmage and beat Colorado. Gardner-Webb, nothing. But then you get to the Clemson game, okay? And this isn't a prediction video. Again, I'm getting ready to do Georgia Tech soon, and this is one of the things I need to decide on. Can they beat Clemson? Because here's the thing, the whole point. What if they beat Clemson? Look at the rest of the schedule. Look at who they don't think in your mind who you think the favorites are in the ACC this year, okay? You're probably going to think Clemson. But after that, you're going to go Miami. Well, Georgia Tech doesn't play Miami. Louisville, well, they don't play Louisville. SMU, well, they don't play SMU. They do play Clemson. But what if they beat them? If Georgia Tech is good enough to beat Clemson in week 3, show me on this schedule where the expected loss would be after that. If they're good enough to beat Clemson, and I'm talking ACC schedule here, okay? The Gardner-Webb game and the Temple game, if they lose those games, forget it. They got bigger issues than whether or not, what if they beat Clemson. But at Wake Forest, they'll be favored. If they beat Clemson, they'll be favored. Home against Virginia Tech. They lost to them on the road last year. Revenge situation. Get them at home coming off of a bye week. They'll be favored. At Duke. Duke's a good team. But if Georgia Tech can beat Clemson, they should be favored against Duke. Syracuse lost a lot from last year. We ought to see if Fran Brown can sort of recreate last year with a whole new roster, basically. He's just a second-year coach. At NC State, No one's talking about them. Another bye week at Boston College, home against Pitt. Where's the other game on here that you're 60, 70% certain Georgia Tech would lose if they were good enough to beat this? Remember, this is what if they beat Clemson. What other game on here would you say there's 70% chance of losing? Maybe the Georgia game at the end of the year, but that's a non-conference game. All right, so then we get back to the sort of Georgia Tech's inability to sort of to play consistently well. Remember last year, beat Miami, almost beat Georgia, but then lose to Virginia Tech for no reason, a bad team. So where's a loss like that on here? At Duke, at Duke won't be easy. Home against Syracuse, if Fran Brown proves to be as good as he was last year, that could prove to be maybe a difficult game. Maybe NC State surprises people, but it's hard. I don't really see that. But if they beat Clemson, though, they could probably lose 2 of those games and still make the ACC championship, couldn't they? If Georgia Tech beats Clemson, what do you think their record would be at the end of the year? I just put it in the comments. Like, if Georgia Tech beats Clemson, I think they'll end up 10-2. Whatever you think it is. I'm really curious. I feel like Georgia Tech is putting a lot of eggs in this basket of this Clemson game here. And I don't blame them because, again, you look at the rest of the schedule. If they can beat Clemson, the rest of those games all of a sudden look very winnable for Georgia Tech, outside of the occasional shit-to-bed game, which is impossible to predict. And then you got the Georgia game at the end. But again, the way the playoffs and everything are set up now, it's not that the Georgia game is irrelevant. Tech obviously wants to win that. And if they're sitting on 2 losses, the Georgia game is huge because a third loss could prevent them from making the playoffs potentially, right? So I'm not minimizing the importance of that game, but I'm specifically looking at a Georgia Tech route to the playoff potentially by winning the ACC. If they can beat Clemson, where's the loss? Let me know down below. What if Georgia Tech beats the Taters? All right, let's move on to the next one. What if Lagway stays healthy? Now, the Florida fans are putting, I think, unreasonable expectations on DJ Lagway. So I'll just get that out here right in the beginning. They're sort of falling into, I think, the same sort of trap that some Tennessee fans fell into with Nico over the last couple of years. A highly rated quarterback commits to your school when you've kind of been down for a long time, and in the eyes of the fan, he becomes almost like a savior of the program type figure, right? And there were times last year where DJ Lagway played extremely well. There's no doubt about it. I mean, his record is 6-1 as a starter, or 5-1, whatever it was. He did have the injury concerns, and that's sort of the angle I'm taking here in this video. What if he stays healthy? What if he avoids those injuries and he stays healthy for the entirety of the season? What do we think Florida's ceiling would be in that case? Because a lot of the Florida fans are telling you that if Lagway stays healthy, they're playing for the SEC championship this year. And they're not trolling. They're serious. Now, I know it's the offseason and fan is short for fanatic, and fans tend to be delusional as fuck in June every year. Florida fans are serious. A lot of them are. Now, are some of them trolling? Maybe. But there are, for a team whose best season over the last 4 years was 7-5, they have a lot of confidence, Florida fans do, that they're beating Georgia, beating Miami early in the season. I mean, these are playoff caliber teams you're talking about Florida beating, with a head coach, Billy Napier, who's 19-19 in his career at Florida, 500 record, the worst start to a coaching career of any Florida head coach in history. So, well, unless you go back 100 years. But in all of our lifetime, it's the worst start to a Florida coach's start to a career ever. But they think they can compete to win the SEC and make the playoffs against the schedule that they know they have and that they know is hard, right? But what if DJ Lagway stays healthy? And I'm not necessarily talking to Florida fans here because, like I said, Florida fans, they think if Lagway stays healthy, they're going 10-2 and making the SEC championship game. And I'm just going to tell you right off the jump, I don't think that's the case. But if Lagway stays healthy all year, plays at a high level, and can cut down on the turnover problems that he had last year, what if that happens? All right. Well, you have to assume wins against Long Island and USF no matter what, right? But then, I mean, just look at the next 4 games. At LSU, at Miami, home against Texas, and at Texas A&M. 4 games in a row against top 25 teams. What's Napier's record against top 25 teams? Somebody let me know. 2 of these teams are likely to be in the top 10, LSU and Texas. It's possible Miami's in the top 10 if they beat Notre Dame in week 1. They're going to be ranked nonetheless. 2 of these games are on, 3 of those games are on the road. 3 of those 4 games are on the road. If Lagway is 100% healthy, plays at a high level, doesn't turn the ball over, what's Florida's record after the Texas A&M? We'll even throw Mississippi State in there. What's Florida's record going into their second bye week? Best case scenario, ceiling, DJ Lagway stays healthy, plays at a high level, doesn't turn the ball over, improves off of what we saw him do last year. What's the best case scenario here? 4-2? I think 4-2 is the best case scenario. I think that's the best case scenario. And then you have the second half of the schedule. It starts off with Georgia. Florida will be an underdog. On the road at Kentucky, Florida will be a small favorite. On the road at Ole Miss, Florida might be a favorite there, close to a toss-up situation. A lot of questions about Ole Miss that need to be answered. They will be answered by the time that game is played. Home against Tennessee. Tennessee struggles on the road. Again, we're doing what if Lagway is healthy. I know this is late in the year, but what if he's 100% healthy, playing at a high level? Florida can beat Florida State and Tennessee, if that's the case. Georgia, Kentucky, Ole Miss, I think best case, absolute best case is 2-1 there. 2-1. And I'm giving them wins against Tennessee and Florida State. So that's 1, 2, 3. That's 1, 2. That's 4-1 in the back half of the schedule after that second bye week. 4-2. Something's not adding up, is it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I guess that would be 5-2. So it would be 5-2 in the top half of the schedule, best case scenario. You know, to me, it would be obvious wins against Long Island, South Florida, and Mississippi State. That's 3 guaranteed wins before the second bye week, in my opinion. So then you're looking at how many of those 4 games can they win at LSU, at Miami, home against Texas, and at Texas A&M. 3 out of those 4 are on the road. The toughest team they do get at home, that's Texas. I think I'm being generous by saying they win 2 of those games. I think that's a fair and generous sort of ceiling. So 2 losses in the first half of the season before the second bye week. Best case scenario in the second half of the season would be 1 loss. So to me, if I'm trying to view Florida in the most optimistic way possible, what if Lagway plays healthy, lives up to all the hype the fans are dumping on him, and improves over what we saw last year? What if that all that happens? 9-3 and playing in the Capital One Bowl or something? I don't see anything better than that. Am I wrong? I mean, look, I think 9-3 would be a great year for Florida. I ain't that's the ceiling. What if DJ Lagway stays healthy? 9-3 would be the best they could do. I still think 7 or 8 wins would be more likely. I just still think 7 or 8 wins would be more likely, but I think 9-3 would be like potential. Maybe. All right. And what if Ohio State loses to Michigan again at the end of the year, which would be the 5th year in a row, all under Ryan Day, by the way. They've lost 21, 22, 23, and 24. So Ryan Day and Ohio State have lost to Michigan 4 years in a row. We all know that, right? Harbaugh's now gone. Sharon Moore comes in. He beats them now. Ohio State went on to win the national title last year, which makes that pill a little easier to swallow, that they lost to Michigan for the 4th year in a row, but still have to hear it from Michigan fans year round. And luckily for Ohio State, they only had 1 loss heading into the Michigan game. But let's go back and look at last year's Ohio State season, because this is something I've talked about once or twice before, but not something I think that's really gotten enough attention. as far as how close Ohio State was to not even making the playoffs. And keep in mind, they went on an unbelievable run and just destroyed everybody in the playoffs, basically en route to a national championship. But let's go back and look at how their season unfolded, okay? Because it's real easy to sort of focus on how good they were at the end of the year and kind of forget some of the hiccups that happened along the way, other than the Michigan game, which is obvious. They beat Akron, Western Michigan, and Marshall. That was their non-con schedule. They played 3 lower classification schools. They beat them all, blew them all out. On the road at Michigan State, one of the worst teams in the Big Ten, they blew them out. Home against Iowa, a decent team defensively, and Ohio State put up 35 on them. Oh, that was a good game, actually, by Ohio State. The Oregon game, I thought Ohio State played good against Oregon. Now, sometimes it's hard, especially if you're a fan of Ohio State. It's hard when your team loses. It's hard as a fan to go, man, they played good, because you want to focus on the negative when your team loses, because in your mind you're like, what could we have done better to win? If we could have done something better, that must mean we didn't play good. I thought Ohio State played good against Oregon. Very tough environment on the road there, 32-31. Will Howard had that blunder at the end of the game, but so they very easily could have won that game, but they lost it. Then they had a bye week, and then that following week, when you look back at Ohio State's season last year, this Nebraska game saved their season for Ohio State. It looked like for a lot of this game that Ohio State was going to lose. And really, they probably should have lost. I don't mean the game was robbed from them or Nebraska cheated. That's not what I mean. Nebraska outplayed them for the overwhelming majority of this game, particularly along the lines of scrimmage, which became very important later in the year when they played Michigan. But Ohio State hung on and found a way to win that Nebraska game. And that meant that when they took that loss at the end of the year to Michigan, it was only their second loss. So they were 10-2, and they obviously got into the playoffs, a 5-8 seed, and hosted a first-round home game where they beat Tennessee. The rest is history. They went on to win the national title. If they would have lost either of these two games, look at Nebraska and Penn State, both one-score games here. 21-17, they hang on at home to beat Nebraska. 20-13 on the road at Penn State. Now, the Penn State game, to me, was never really in doubt, even though it was a one-score game. Ohio State controlled that game. We know the the story when it comes to Penn State. We don't need to get into that. Ohio State beat them. But you look back on last year, especially knowing that they lost to Michigan, and you look at that Nebraska game, Ohio State was this damn close to not even making the playoffs last year, which would have been a shame because they were the most talented team in the country, and at the end of the year, when it counted, they were the best team in the country, and they deserved to win that national title. They were dominant in a playoff field where they had to beat 4 top 10 teams in a row, and they did it. So I'm not taking anything away from them. And this is sort of an idea we're going to have to get used to as college football fans. Flawed teams are going to make the playoffs and be extremely dangerous. That has never been the case before in college football. You go back to the days where you had really no postseason outside of random bowl matchups, to the BCS, to the 4-team playoff. You never had to worry about some kind of outlier getting hot at the end of the season and running through the playoffs. An outlier was finishing 6th, 7th, or 8th in the final rankings, which is what Ohio State did last year, and they weren't getting in. They didn't have an opportunity to get into the playoffs to sort of make a run, get hot at the end of the year. Now you do. Ohio State did it last year, and it's something we're going to have to get used to. But if they'd have lost that Nebraska game, this Michigan game would have sent them home packing. They would not have made the playoffs. And Ryan Day might not have survived. So what if that ends up happening this year? What if? What if? And again, this isn't a prediction. This is a what if. All right? So let's figure out a what if that could lead to a similar scenario. They, of course, play Michigan at the end of the year. And for this what if scenario, we're assuming an Ohio State loss. Okay? They've lost 4 in a row. What if they lose a 5th in a row to Michigan? And what if they already have 2 losses when that happens? Well, if you're looking for 2 losses, Texas is a possibility. I think at Washington is a possibility. At Illinois is a possibility. Penn State is a possibility. I don't think any of the other games are possibilities. They're not losing to Grambling. They're not losing to Ohio. They're not losing to Minnesota. They're not losing to Wisconsin. They're not losing to Purdue. They're not losing to UCLA. They're not losing to Rutgers. Now, I also don't think they're losing to all of those other teams. But remember, we only have to find a total of 2 losses before the Michigan game. So maybe they lose to Texas and then on the road at Illinois. Maybe they beat Texas, but then lose on the road at Illinois and home to Penn State. Maybe they beat Penn State like they always do for whatever reason, but somehow they slip up at Washington. So they lose, at Washington into Texas. In other words, regardless of what path you go down to get to 3 losses total, what if the point and the question, the what if scenario I'm asking is, what if Ohio State goes 9-3 and the 3rd loss is to Michigan and Ohio State doesn't make the playoffs? What if that happens? Has Ryan Day bought enough goodwill with the fans from a national title last year that they would stomach 9-3 and a loss to Michigan? Because here's the thing, it's not one or the other. It's got to be both. Because I'll tell you, as a Georgia fan who waited a lifetime to see Georgia win a national title and then win 2 in a row, they haven't won one since. It doesn't mean I'm ready to run the coach out of town, right? I mean, it wasn't that long ago. So I'm not suggesting that if Ohio State doesn't win a natty, the fans should be calling for Ryan Day's head. I'm not suggesting that. But if they don't even make the playoffs, and it's specifically because he lost a 5th game in a row to Michigan, I'm telling you, some of their fans will tell me that they've seen enough. So you will see some Ohio State fans with the Fire Ryan Day speech if they go 9-3, if the 3rd loss is to Michigan, and if it keeps them out of the playoffs. Now, that's a lot of ifs. And again, the whole point of this video with the what ifs, these are not things that are likely to happen. I do not think Ohio State is likely to have 3 losses. Ryan Day's never lost 3 games in a season, so I'm not predicting this. These are things to think about. These are what-if scenarios that have less than a 50% chance of happening, in my opinion, but more than a 0% chance of happening. And again, I went back to last year with Ohio State to sort of show you how close they were to this exact scenario happening last year. And that was with a non-conference schedule that didn't include a top 5 team in Texas like it does this year. So I don't think you can just dismiss it out of hand. There's no way that's happening. They're not losing 3 games. They're not losing to Michigan. Now, the Ohio State fans, I know you feel that way and you want to believe that, and I get it. And eventually you will beat Michigan again. And it might be this season. Again, this isn't a prediction video I'm doing here, okay? But you got to play them there. They beat you last year with no offense at all. You got to assume their offense be at least a little bit better. I mean, I don't know. That game's a long way away. This isn't a prediction. But boy, what if? What if Georgia Tech beats Clemson early in the year? That's their toughest game. Doesn't it look like Georgia Tech's heading to the ACC championship game if they beat Clemson early in the year? What if DJ Lagway stays healthy all year at Florida and plays as well as the fans are sort of projecting him to play? I think Florida could go 9-3. And what if Ohio State loses to Michigan for the 5th year in a row, and that loss is their 3rd loss of the season that knocks them out of the playoffs? What would the fans do? Let me know down below how you liked this video. Let me know what you think about these 3 what-if scenarios. And if you like this video, let me know that, because I've got a whole list written out here of sort of what-if scenarios from different things around college football, and maybe I can make this into a series over the next few weeks. But anyway, I do appreciate you listening. Make sure you're subscribed, hit the thumbs up, and have a good morning.